There are three main greenhouse gases, both globally and in New Zealand: carbon dioxide and then the other two, methane and nitrous oxide. In the New Zealand context, we call them the biological gases because they are almost entirely the result of the action of microbes. In the case of methane, microbes inside the digestive system of animals. In the case of nitrous oxide, microbes in the soil. Almost all of the biological gases come from agriculture, and together they make up about half of all our greenhouse gases. It is 13 years since the fuss about the misnamed fart tax. Misnamed because, of course, methane comes out of the front end, not the back end of the animal. We understand the nature and origin of the biological gases much better now, but we're still struggling with what to do about them. There is a very polarised debate about whether or not they should be in the emissions trading scheme, the ETS. To me, that's too narrow a question now. To me, the question should really be this: what should we do about the methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture? So I'm broadening it out and raising it up. And the aim of this report is to get some traction beyond the narrow polarised debate over in or out of the ETS. And what we're aiming to do with this is to lay out a factual basis that will provide for a more constructive discussion of all the things that we might be able to do. Some may be involving the ETS. And so to that end, this report covers a number of aspects, including these: how are the biological gases formed, how do they behave in the atmosphere, and importantly, what might be done about them. But before we get into the heavy stuff, we've known about these gases for some time. This is an old painting of Will-o'-the-Wisp, ghost lights that terrified travellers in Europe. They thought it was supernatural beings trying to lure them to their death in the marshes, but now we know it's the methane outgassing from the marshes that's caught alight. So that's the old version of methane. And the other gas, nitrous oxide, discovered in the 18th century, named laughing gas because its first use, and use for a long time, was to get a party going. But let's leave the 18th century behind and come back to pastoral farming in the 21st century. Methane out of the digestive systems of the animals known as ruminants: sheep, cattle, deer and goats, but not pigs or chickens. And nitrous oxide mostly outgassing from urine patches on the soil. In a little more detail, here's where the methane comes from. Ruminants have a 4-stage digestion system. The first stage takes place in the rumen, and you're looking at a picture of the rumen there. The brown part is a soup of microbes, the green part is half-digested grass, and the white part is a layer of gases including methane. Some of the methane comes out in the breath of the animal, but most of it is burped out when the rumen contracts involuntarily, which it does every minute or so. The reason these animals are so valuable to humans is because of this digestive system. They can eat grass, very tough plant material, and turn it into protein, into meat and milk and wool. And here is a nitrous oxide. Now I'm sorry about the diagram, but I assure you it is a simplification. It starts with urea, both in the fertiliser and in the urine, and it's all about what microbes in the soil do to that urea. The nitrogen in it ends up in 3 places. Some outgasses as nitrous oxide, some fertilises the grass, and some is leached into waterways where it fertilises plants that we don't want, like algal blooms. So there is an important connection between water quality and the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. But if we go back to these 3 gases again, carbon dioxide, absolutely the main problem. Methane, molecule for molecule, much more powerful than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide, molecule for molecule, much more powerful than methane, but not so much of it. The first one and the third one, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, are both long-lived in the atmosphere, but methane is different. It is a short-lived gas in the atmosphere, it decomposes into others. Each molecule lasts, on average, about 12 years. And this is a big focus of discussion in New Zealand because methane is such a large proportion of our emissions. Now we have an entire chapter, chapter 3 in this report, dedicated to this complicated issue. But I want to make a point
that while a methane molecule might disappear in about 12 years, it leaves some damage behind. About 90% of the heat it traps while it's there is absorbed into the ocean, where it contributes to sea level rise and obviously the warming of the ocean as well, more generally. But I want to move now to the question of what we can do about the two biological gases. There are many scientists toiling away on this, trying to find things that work in the laboratory and might work on farms. There are some things that farmers can do now. For example, not applying too much fertiliser and timing the application better, using feed pads on dairy farms, getting the cows off the soil, changing the mix of stock, planting trees. In the report, though, there are 4 chapters that deal with the biotechnology and management options that are the subject of a whole lot of active research that's been going on for some years. Potential mitigation actions that could reduce the biological emissions. And in those 4 chapters, we look at these possible actions in the light of 5 questions. And these are our 5 questions. Is it effective, whatever this is? Does it actually work? Does it reduce the emissions from the animal? Secondly, are there other impacts? They could be positive impacts or negative impacts. Thirdly, could it become cost effective to do? Fourthly, how readily would it integrate into the farming systems we have in New Zealand? And lastly, what about its potential at the national level? Would it make a sizable dent in methane and or nitrous oxide? If you have good positive answers to these questions, you have found a silver bullet. So the 4 chapters really are looking at what we've found out in the light of those questions about the research that's going on now. And it's done under the following 4 chapter headings. The first one is about breeding low emission sheep and cattle, because you can take 2 animals which will be equally productive. One will be a low emitter of methane and the other one will be a higher emitter of methane. The second area we looked at was low emission animal feed, because it turns out that what you feed animals can affect the production of these 2 gases. Thirdly, we looked at targeting the methanogens. Now, the methanogens are the 5% of microbes in the rumen that produce methane. The rest don't. So can we hit those methanogens in some way directly in the rumen? And lastly, turning to nitrous oxide again, can we do something about the urine patches and the fertiliser that are the source of that particular gas? So what does all this research add up to? The answer is not much yet. First, there is no silver bullet on the horizon. At the end of these 4 chapters, we have put estimates of the impact various mitigations actions could have, how much they could reduce New Zealand's biological emissions. I want to stress these are high-end estimates with all the stars in alignment. They've simply been provided to give a sense of the potential scale that these things might deliver. But I would caution against these estimates being added together to give a total. Adding them up assumes all the research will come to fruition. Adding them up assumes that all the potential actions can be readily integrated into our farming systems. Adding them up assumes the number of ruminant animals in the country stays the same, etc., etc. These would be brave assumptions. For instance, one subject of intensive research is a methane vaccine, where the vaccinated animal would produce antibodies that attack the microbes, the methanogens in the rumen that produce the methane. A methane vaccine has everything going for it, except it doesn't exist yet, and it may never exist. So we are going to have to deal with the biological emissions in a variety of ways, including new ways of using some of our rural land. And that brings me to trees. Farmers already plant trees for many purposes. Trees take carbon dioxide out of the air as they grow. We all learned about photosynthesis at school. Trees don't take methane or nitrous oxide out of the air, but they can take an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide out instead. Now, obviously, I'm talking about carbon forests, and in the report, we look at 2 very different kinds of carbon forests, and this is the first. Hill country, where there's very little grazing and a lot of work clearing scrub. Fence it off and let it go. The manuka grows, and then the kānaka, and eventually the forest returns. Such a forest would take carbon dioxide out of the air slowly, but it would go on doing it year after year after year for hundreds of years. There is at least 1 million hectares where this could be done, and it would help us with other environmental problems around soil erosion and water quality. And there's another plus, manuka honey. This is the other kind of forest we looked at, rotation pine. It's really the other extreme from the regenerating podocarp forest. Pine takes carbon dioxide out of the air very quickly, but only for about 20 or 30 years until it is harvested. But that is still valuable because it buys some time for other options to be developed. But there can be many kinds of forests. This is a eucalyptus carbon forest in Taranaki. It's earning its owner many thousands of dollars each year in carbon credits, and this particular species will go on growing and storing carbon for 300 years. And here is why, in summary, I've become so positive about trees. Photosynthesis is simplicity itself compared with the arcane mysteries of the rumen and the complexity of what happens after the urine hits the soil. In summary, the biological methane and nitrous oxide that come from farming amount to about half our greenhouse gas emissions. In Paris, the world committed to limiting global warming. If we are to succeed, the next few decades will be crucial. We cannot go on ignoring these biological gases. There have been a number of false starts. Now we have to make a real start. The polarised debate in or out of the ETS hasn't got us anywhere. We have to move forward, find some ways to get going. We must take one step to begin with, but not stop with a token action. We must take one step and then another and then another. The ETS may well be part of this, but there are other ways of doing things. We need to be practical and realistic. And what is done must be based on an understanding of the science. There aren't any silver bullets on the horizon, but there are some things that can be done, and trees will be a big part of this. 1 million hectares of trees would make a significant difference and help with soil erosion and water quality as well. In the long term, we must diversify. Finding different ways of using our rural land will be critical. Together with industry, the government has set up 2 working groups, one on biological emissions and one on forestry. This is encouraging. And at the end of the report, there are a few ideas for them and for others to consider. I am particularly pleased that New Zealand now has a chapter of Globe International, an organisation of MPs from different parties in 80 different countries working together on climate change. New Zealand farmers have shown time and again that they can adapt to new challenges. The world will continue to need food, but in the long term, the way food is grown and the types of food grown will have to change. But we here cannot wait for the long term before doing anything. Continuing delay is not our friend, and neither are abrupt transitions. Continuing delay just makes an abrupt transition more likely. The transition must begin. Thank you.